Amy. So good morning, everyone. Happy New Year to you all. So I'm going to start the webinar by explaining the off-payroll working legislation, looking at the reasons for its introduction, who it applies to, how it evolved, and what the new changes are in April 2021. So I'll then hand over to Claire, who will then take you through what you need to do to prepare for these latest changes. And also we'll discuss the implications that they will have for payroll operations. Now, as you go through the webinar today, some of you may, and you may already, seeing as you've seen some of the slides, may have a sense of deja vu. And if so, it's probably because these slides were previously presented last year. And that was just before HMRC decided to delay the changes until this year. And we can guarantee that this is now going ahead. It has got royal assent. Now, much of the core content on these slides is the same, but we have, of course, taken into account any changes that have been announced over the last 12 months. So next slide, please, Amy. Thank you. So what is the legislation then, and where did it all begin? So off-payroll working rules were introduced back in April 2000. They were announced on a budget news release in 1999 and referenced as Item 35 and are now commonly known as IR35 legislation. So what was the purpose of this legislation? So in short, it was to ensure that what was determined to be disguised employees should pay broadly the same tax and national insurance contributions as regular employees. So, disguised employees, what does that mean? These are workers who receive payments from a client via an intermediary, so for example, their own limited company, but whose relationship with their client is such that if they'd been paid directly, they would actually be employees of the client. So what was the issue? So with disguised employees. So the government felt, apart from the fact that obviously it's a lot less revenue for them, that it was unfair that the tax liability on payments to these disguised employees was considerably lower than that paid to direct employees who were subject to PAYE. So a very common example that is cited is the cases of the Friday to Monday scenario. So back in that day, it was common for people to leave an employment on a Friday where they were an employee and then return on Monday to the same job as a hired consultant. So that was kind of the original purpose all the way back. So in April 2000, the off-payroll working rules meant that contractors were now obliged to consider if the rules applied to them and they needed to consider that whenever they provided their service to a client through an intermediary. So, and if they felt that that relationship was in fact broadly the same as an employer and employee, they would be responsible for paying that level of tax and paying it over to, and the contractor's intermediary, what is commonly known as a personal services company, come on to that a bit later, would be responsible for paying the tax and national insurance over to HMRC. So I just want to emphasize that the rules only apply to this type of individual who work just like employees. And if you look at the definition of the current employment status test, those are the types of individuals that this is targeted at, and it does not apply to the self-employed. Okay, so that the government brought that in all those years ago, actually right at the start of my payroll career in 2000. But, however, in spite of tax evasion being a very serious crime in the UK, there remained widespread non-compliance. So, to address this, in April 2017, the government decided to change how the off-payroll working rules operate, but only for companies within the public sector. So, what was the measure that they brought in? The change was that the public sector organisation would now become responsible for making the assessment of the status of the contractor for tax purposes. So that was the important change. It shifted, that responsibility shifted from the contractor to the organisation. And if the contractor was then determined to be a deemed employee, okay, so not an employee with employment rights, but with the status of employment for tax purposes, the fee payer is now responsible for reporting and paying the tax and national insurance to HMRC on behalf of the contractor. So the fee payer is usually the public sector organisation or the agency who pays the contractor's personal service company or intermediary. So these measures have resulted in greater compliance within the public sector. So this measure seems to be working much rather than where you could compare, like a contractor being responsible to marking your own homework, but maybe that's why it's not working terribly well. So outside of the public sector, non-compliance is a growing problem. So these new changes for April 2021, which we all need to focus on, the changes are that the measures that were applied in 2017 to the public sector are now going to be extended into the large to medium large businesses within the private sector. So just to emphasize, it's only client organizations defined as small within the Companies Act of 2006 will be outside of the scope of changes. And we'll talk about this definition of small in more detail, and it is quite involved. So Claire will explain much more about that later on. And she'll also talk about what happens if your business changes in size. So what happens if you're deemed to be small in April 2021, but then you suddenly become very successful and become a large organisation. So there are rules around that, and there's also rules around relationships with parent companies, etc., and what determines what is the size of the company. So yeah, a lot of rules around connected and associated companies. Okay, so another change that we need to think about is the process of determining the status of the contractor for tax purposes. So and the issue of what we call a status determination statement, the SDS. Now this is already in place in the public sector, but there are certain changes to the rules around that. So when a business needs to determine whether off-payroll working rules applied, they need to consider what their relationship is with between the contractor and themselves. So even if you're going through a number of agencies, when you're making that decision, you need to think about that relationship between the engager or whoever's buying in those services and the contractor. And the contractor is that engager is in the best position to know what is involved within those conditions of the contract. So this is where the responsibility lies when this determination is being made. So it's really important before you start thinking about setting up an off-payroll working payroll to make sure that you take due care in making these assessments, and therefore this will then determine whether you need to set up an off-payroll working payroll. Okay, so the check for employment status for tax, the government have got a digital tool. You've probably researched this already, and it did come under a lot of criticism, but over the past 12 months, there's been a lot of improvements to it. It's a free digital tool available on gov.uk, and it will help you to determine the employee status. It's an awful lot of questions that are asked, and it is reliant on you entering accurate information. But from this tool, you can print a dated copy, and it provides the information which you have entered and the corresponding results. And this does give you a valid SDS, which you can then pass on. So really good tool there, and especially, you know, the government will take a view as to, you know, who is making these determinations. Of course, they're going to expect far more from a much larger company with departments, finance departments, etc., than that of, say, a much smaller company. And I think as long as you demonstrate that you have taken due care in making these assessments, that should be fine. And this tool is really good in demonstrating that you have taken due care. So you also will need to communicate the decision in the form of a SDS to the contractor, and it's important that it goes directly to the contractor, but you also need to pass it through any third party that they contract with. There's no specific format. You just need to include what's been decided and the reasons for that determination. So just a word of warning. So each party must pass on the SDS until it's received by whoever pays the fees. So the revenue, when it comes to penalties, if there's a failure between the flow of information of this SDS, the penalty will be applied to whatever agency failed to pass on that information to the fee payer, and consequently they will be responsible for the NI and tax deductions that were due. So naturally, if there are any changes to terms and conditions, then this SDS must be reviewed. So for the public sector, they're already using this system, but they have not up till now been required to put the reasons on there. So that's another change for them. Now, there is a disagreement process, which is client-led, not an HMRC process. So if a contractor disagrees with the process, there needs to be dialogue, and there's really strict timelines around the response times to any challenge to a decision. But I just want to say that again, this is going to be client-led, and the HMRC have stated that they're not going to make any decisions on it, because again, it's the client who is in the best position to understand the terms of the contract. Now, there's a huge amount of published guidance which HMRC have published, which clarifies this disagreement process. and all other items relating to the off-payroll working processes. And they also have examples of how organisations can demonstrate they've taken reasonable care, and also on the status disagreements. Okay, thank you, Amy. Next slide. So that's more or less what's happening. So just to summarise, and this is what the CIPP have stated, that the rules seek to ensure that individuals who work like employees but through an intermediary to a client in the private sector will also operate in a similar manner to that operated in the public sector. That's a nice summary by our CIPP. So thank you, Amy. Next slide. So I'm just going to go over some of the common terminology that that's come up throughout this session, and indeed out there in the wider public. So intermediaries. So an intermediary is a party who makes arrangements for or pays an individual to work for a third party. And the off-payroll working rules apply to a worker's intermediary. Okay. So I just want to also, while we're talking about off-payroll working rules applying to workers' intermediary, but that's only if that status has been defined by going through that due care and those checks for the employment status for tax. Okay, so the government will the government have emphasised that you cannot just be risk averse and think anyone we're paying through an intermediary now needs to have off-payroll working rules applied. I mean, this is where you'll get into disagreements. So it's really careful that you just don't take a blanket response to that. So you really must prepare and start engaging with your contractors to work this one out. So personal service company, commonly known PSC, is a type of intermediary where the worker has a material interest in a company. So that usually means that they're either a director of the company, able to control more than 5% of the ordinary share capital of the company, either directly or indirectly. And the client or the engager. Now, these are the organisations which enter into the contracts with workers. So public sector engagers and large to medium entities within the private sector must now determine the employment status for tax purposes. Okay, so for tax purposes, not for employment rights, for tax purposes. A deemed employee. Now, this is the key one, isn't it? So a deemed employee is a worker who provides services to a client through an intermediary, but would be classed as an employee if they were contracted directly. So we come full circle back to April 2000. This is what the original intention was. CEST is check employment status for tax. So again, like I've just mentioned, it is a digital tool on gov.uk that's able to assist you with this check and to determine if contractors are deemed employees. Now, please take reasonable care, and as I said, please don't be risk averse and just apply off-payroll working rules without going through these checks. So the status determination statement, that's SDS, and that, again, as I said, it includes the status and the reasons for the definition, and it must be passed directly to a contractor and passed through the relevant agencies. Okay. So next slide, Amy. Thank you. So just to summarise what's the current situation. So as we said, this current situation is one that was introduced in April 2017, where if you engage the services of a consultant within the private sector, through their own intermediary or PSC, then it is the contractor at the moment who is responsible for determining their status, and it's their PSC who would be responsible for paying over the relevant tax and national insurances. Now, obviously, in the public sector, as I said, this shifted back in 2017 to be the responsibility of the engager, the client engager, and it's the fee payer within the public sector. So whoever pays that intermediary who is responsible for paying that over, but it's the client engager who makes that decision on the status. And so from April 2021, these rules that were applied to the public sector are now coming through to medium or large size private sector businesses that employ the services of consultants and will be responsible for determining their employment status. So I hope from a very high level that's given you a picture of what the big changes are. It's that shift in responsibility. It is now the engager who is responsible for determining the status for tax of these contractors. So a lot of preparation needs to be made before you decide whether or not you require the off-payroll working rules to be applied to your contractors, and indeed for our more paid clients, whether you need to have the off-payroll working payroll set up for you. So I'm conscious that we've just got nearly 11 weeks ahead before end of year. I'm sure most of you involved in the payroll world will be very conscious of that. So I'm going to pass over now to Claire, who's going to talk about what we need to do before 6th of April 2021 and how it's going to affect the payroll. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. As Chris has said, there are quite a few things that need to be done by all clients to ensure that they are ready for these changes that come into effect for the 6th of April. Obviously, you know, if you are already part of a public sector, you will be familiar with these changes. These changes really do affect our private sector businesses that are out there. The legislation will not be delayed now. It has received royal assent, so it is definitely going ahead for the 6th of April. And there are a few key things that you really need to be aware of, and indeed start working on to make sure you are in the best place possible to create the relevant processes in place for these types of employees. Thank you, Amy. Next slide, please. So what do you need to do? Okay, there are a few things in order that you need to do. The first one being to check the qualification criteria. As Chris mentioned, this specific legislation refers to medium and large size businesses now in the private sector. So anyone who is classed as a small business is not affected by this piece of legislation. What I do want to be really clear on at this point is that it's important to understand that the size is not based on an individual company. For example, if you are in one of a group of companies, i.e. you have parent companies, and that could be worldwide, it's the whole group size that is considered for this criteria. So if you are in one of a number of companies, even worldwide, it is the total size that defines the criteria for small, medium, or large. So the first thing to do is check if you are classed as a small business and whether you need to operate within the rules for IR35. Now, you would need to monitor the size of your business annually within your business year, as it could change. I will come on to what happens if it does change in a moment. HMRC have defined 3 key questions to determine if you qualify as small. So what are the rules for that? Okay, you need to meet 2 of the 3 requirements to be subject to IR35 regulations. Okay, so if you're a small business, you will meet 2 of these 3 criteria. Okay, so if you can answer yes to 2 of these 3 criteria, you will not be subject to IR35. The first one being, if your annual turnover is not more than £10.2 million, if your balance sheet total is not more than £5.1 million, or if your number of employees is not greater than 50. If you can answer yes to 2 of those 3 questions, you are deemed as a small business and you do not need to operate IR35. However, just to recap, you need to ensure that if you are part of a group of companies, i.e. you have parent companies, it's the whole size of the group that is considered, and that includes even worldwide entities within that group. Okay. Now, if you do have a business that does change in size over time, and obviously this can happen either where you grow or you may go smaller, there is criteria and rules that determine how you then work the criteria definition for subsequent years. So if you were defined as small in April 2021, you are not subject to IR35. If your business has changed during the business year, and for instance, in December of 2021, the criteria now defines you as medium, you still do nothing. You are still not eligible for the IR35 rules. You do the criteria definition again in April of 2022. So you run that same 3 questions through and you determine that you're now a medium-sized business. However, you still do not need to do anything for that year. You are still classed as outside of IR35. It gets to April 2023 and you run the criteria again. The criteria says you are still medium-sized. So you've changed in December 2021, you were medium in April of 2022, and in April 2023, when you run the criteria check again, you are medium-sized. You then are applicable to the IR35 rules, and you must then use the criteria to determine your worker statuses. That same logic applies if you go down in size. So if you are medium size as of April 2021, and you continue to December 2021, where it's deemed you're small, you remain small in April 2022, and then in April 23, you're still deemed as small. That is when the regulations will apply to you. So they almost give you a 2-year opportunity to see what your criteria has changed to and remained at before you're then subject to the legislation. Okay. The next check is to check how many contractors you may employ by an intermediary, i.e. the PSC. So you have to do an audit of your contractor workers. So firstly, do you employ the services of a PSC, or do you do so via an agency? If you do this, you'll need to determine the employment status of these and inform your payroll department or your relevant agency of your decision of whether they're to be put on the payroll. HMRC have said they will accept the findings of the tool provided the questions are completely correct. Okay, so you can print these out, as Chris has said, for the status determination statement. Okay. You obviously check your employment status for tax obligations, which is using HMRC's CEST tool. This is available online at gov.uk and is designed to help businesses check the employment status of individuals and determine whether the off-payroll working rules apply to those individuals. Okay. So if you then come to the conclusion that they are a deemed employee, there are certain things you will need to do internally. You need to determine with your finance people how the invoice will be dealt with going forward, as there are VAT and expenses potentially to take into account, as well as a main fee for the work performed. So essentially, which department is going to do the paying? Are payroll going to do the paying of all elements, or will finance potentially do the paying of the VAT and expenses? This is something that you need to discuss internally as an organisation and then come to a decision as how that will be split. So the engager will need to communicate with the PSC about their decision and must issue the SDS, the service determination statement, even when the decision is yes, or obviously if it's no, for them being put on the payroll. And the government have provided a response to the consultation on this, which states that the government will legislate to require clients to pass the status determination and reasons for the determination down the contractual chain, as well as passing them directly to the worker. And this is where Chris was referring earlier to the reasonable care, that you must ensure that this is passed down, otherwise you could end up responsible for those tax and NIC implications. Obviously, if you're one of our more pay clients, you must inform us if you're employing the services of a PSC, as these will need to be set up on a separate payroll. More pay are going to be setting up separate payrolls for any of our clients who determine they do have off-payroll workers. Obviously, if you're not a more pay client, you need to discuss this with your provider. If you run an in-house payroll, obviously internally you need to determine how you're going to be setting up for your off-payroll workers. So once the deemed employee is on the payroll, you will need to deduct the appropriate tax and NICs and pay these over to HMRC together with your normal employees' tax and NICs and employers' NICs where appropriate. So the payroll system will send a marker to HMRC on the FPS, informing HMRC that this is an off-payroll worker. So when it comes to enrolling your payrolls on your employees on and off the payroll, you can't transfer the deemed employee to your normal payroll. So if at some point during their tenure with you, you determine that they are actually a full employee, you must make them a leaver on the off-payroll worker payroll and make them a starter on the normal payroll. Similarly, you can't transfer an employee to be a deemed employee onto the normal payroll. You must make them a leaver and then a starter. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. So the implications of the off-payroll working rules. Okay, now more pay, as I've said, are going to be setting up separate payrolls for any of our clients who determine they have off-payroll workers. You do need to engage with your provider or discuss internally as to what you will be doing if you're not a more pay client. You need to think about if you have an integrated HR system and you are going to put them on the same payroll as to what implications there may be. You may have an integrated HR system where you send communications out to your employees where it comes to specific events happening. Do you want deemed workers to have that same content delivered to them, for instance? So there are things to consider if you're not going to set them up onto a separate payroll. Okay. Now, when you have a deemed worker coming through, a starter checklist will need to be completed. A P45 is not accepted for any of these workers. A starter checklist must be provided. Now, we are aware typically that statement C would be ticked on the starter checklist for these people, and as such a BR tax code would be indicated. However, you must apply based on the starter checklist as to what statement they have ticked. You would use the pay date for the first payment as the start date for that deemed employee. And it's important to note that if they have a student loan or postgraduate loan, you would do nothing with this. An off-payroll worker payroll does not have the same employment rights as a normal PAYE payroll. On an off-payroll worker payroll, there is no statutory payments. There is no statutory sick pay, maternity pay, adoption pay. There is no holiday pay. There's no obligation for pension. There's no auto-enrollment set up. Okay, there are lots of things that these types of workers are not eligible for. This is why MorePay have determined it's cleaner and easier to set up a separate payroll, because that reduces the risk of errors being made and people getting payments for things that they are not entitled to as an off-payroll worker. You would, of course, need to insert the usual data such as national insurance number, the date of birth, address, etc. onto that employee record. But you wouldn't insert a salary because you're only paying the main body of the invoice cash figure. So there's no salary that would need to be applied. You would process the invoice figure, less any VAT, and as I said, expenses could go via the payroll or via finance as taxable or non-taxable elements accordingly, depending on the expense. And you would produce a pay slip, so MorePay will absolutely be producing pay slips for these people on those off-payroll worker payrolls. If and when that person is no longer a deemed employee for you and you make them a leaver, a P45 will be issued via the payroll system. And likewise, if they're still a deemed employee as at the 5th of April at the end of the tax year, a P60 would also be issued for them. The payroll systems will pay over any tax NNICs to HMRC, together with any other remittances in the normal manner. So hopefully you can see the importance of why MorePay have determined for our clients, we are going to keep the records very clean by setting up separate payrolls. Obviously, you do need to discuss this with your provider or with your in-house payroll teams as to what method you will be using going forward to determine how to pay these individuals. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Amy, over to you.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Christina. Lots of information there. So we have got lots of questions now. I'm just conscious that we're almost at time, so we're just going to run slightly over in order to answer some questions. If listeners need to leave the webinar, then that's not a problem. You can always catch the end of it via the recording that I'll send later. So let's go through a few questions, and then I'll point you to some helpful resources as well. So we've got a question here that is, you say that they shouldn't be auto-enrolled into a WUPR pension, but can they opt in?
Amy, I'll answer that. So no, they shouldn't. They absolutely shouldn't be auto-enrolled into a WPR pension, and they do not have the option to opt in either. So just remember, these are deemed employees for tax purposes. They're not employees with the general employment rights that other employees have on your regular payroll. So no, they can't opt in.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, if I am given a P45 by the deemed employee, should I use it?
Thanks, Amy. Absolutely not. The rules are clear in that a starter checklist has to be provided and that you apply the relevant tax code based on the statement that has been ticked. As I said, typically we will expect statement C to be ticked, which would mean BR, but obviously that is not set in stone. So you must apply the starter checklist to these individuals.
Okay, lovely, thank you. If someone is taken on as an off-payroll worker but then becomes an employee, can we transfer them from one payroll to another?
Okay, I think possibly this question came in just before Claire's last slide, because of if an off-payroll worker is decided that they are now going to become a regular employee, you must not, under any circumstances, transfer that record from the off-payroll working payroll to the regular payroll. You must make them a leaver and set them up as a new employee on the regular payroll.
Okay. We've actually got a few questions about the two separate payrolls. So someone's asked, why is there a need for the two separate payrolls? Why can't we just, have them done under one?
From a more pay perspective, we've determined that it'll be cleaner and safer and reduces the mitigation of any errors in that these deemed employees are not entitled to the same employment rights, if you like, as a normal contracted employee. For instance, as I said, statutory payments, they are not applicable. Student loans, you would not obviously put them through the system. They can't be auto-enrolled into WPR. There's no holiday pay for these employees. And to make it very, very clean and to make sure that there's no error in submission by either our clients or by More Pay, we have deemed that it is safer to keep these employees on a separate payroll.
Yeah, okay, I think that's clear. All right, so another question here. My contractor invoices me in arrears. When will the off-payroll working rules apply?
Oh, wow, really good question. So thank you, whoever's raised that. So depending on what sector you're working in, so public sector, it's business as usual. You just carry on applying the rules. But for those in the private sector, the off-payroll rules will apply to payments made for services provided on or after the 6th of April 2021. So no, if your contractor is invoicing you in arrears, just make sure that you only apply it to when they started providing you with services on or after 6th of April 2021. A really good point. Thank you for that.
All right, so one more question, I think, because we've well and truly gone over. A few people are asking about employment rights. So we've got one here, which is, will the off-payroll worker get employment rights following April 2021?
Okay, so this is a big subject, as you can appreciate. Employment rights is a very hot topic at the moment, but the off-payroll workers will not benefit from employment rights such as holiday pay, statutory payments, pensions, dismissal rights, etc. However, employment rights are, as you can appreciate, a massive subject. And what we would say at More Pay is that it's really important that you speak to a qualified HR employment law advisor. For instance, at More Pay, we obviously have our advice line team, who are the people that are qualified and in the best place to answer these sort of questions. Obviously, if you're not a More Pay client at present, or you don't have the HR services available to you, please do reach out. We do have that service, and obviously we can help. Obviously, if you have your own services available to you, then please, I would recommend you do use them. It is a big topic.
Yeah, good advice. Thank you, Christina and Claire. Sorry for rushing through some questions there. I'll just wrap up by pointing listeners to some resources. So we have got an off-payroll working guide, which covers off some of the things that Claire and Christina have covered today, but just a bit around the background and what you need to do to prepare. So you can either find that in the Knowledge Centre on our website, but I'll also send that to you as part of the follow-up today. So when I send you the recording and the slides, I'll attach this guide as well. So if you want to take a look at it or share it internally, then go for it. Another thing to point out, so this is for non-payroll customers, we have got an off-payroll working software demo on the 26th of January. So if you are feeling like you need a bit more support and you'd be interested in seeing what we've got to offer and how we might be able to help you, then feel free to sign up to the demo. Again, I'll include that on the follow-up that I send you later today. And just pointing you to the Knowledge Centre that I've mentioned, so this can be found on the More Pay website. It's just full of lots of information. It's all free to access. There's just so much on there, all written by our payroll and HR experts. So we've got legislation guides, we've got past webinar recordings, there's a ton of blogs. I would highly recommend it, whether it's for IR35 or for other topics. Go and have a look around and use the resources on there. So that's everything today. I'm sorry that we've gone over, but hopefully you found the webinar really useful and you're feeling a bit more prepared. As mentioned, the questions that we couldn't get to today, we will take a look at those and put together some form of FAQ and share that in the coming weeks to further support you. A big thank you to Claire and Christina again. It was really great to have you on the webinar and talk everyone through IR35. So I'll close the webinar now and have a good rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.